Good morning. My name is Emily Bierbrower, and I am a member of Westminster's Social Justice Ministry team. We build the social justice forums around a common theme, and this program year, our theme is Wade in the Water, Becoming Anti-Racist. Every forum we hold this year is meant to encourage all of us to listen intently to the voices beyond those of white privilege and to reflect on how we, as a community of faith, can help change a racialized system. Our webinar today is titled Being a Good Neighbor, and will focus on the impacts of the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, and how the community of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Minneapolis utilized their location to respond and take action during the months that followed. With it coming upon the one-year anniversary at the end of May, we want to reflect with Holy Trinity and consider opportunities for engagement this month and beyond. Today, we welcome our panelists from Holy Trinity, lead pastor, Reverend Ingrid Rasmussen, their community engagement and education coordinator, Deacon Rojas Martinez, and their leader in Holy Trinity's response both last summer and now, Kleven. Also, please note that if you have any questions, they can be directed to the live stream where a member of the Social Justice Ministry team will be helping with support and adding any sort of resources necessary. With that said, I will turn it over to Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for the work that you're doing at Westminster. It's if there's been any year where it's very clear to me that we are united across denominational lines and across the city and across the nation and across the globe, this is a year to celebrate those connections and the ways that they strengthen us for common mission. So thanks for having us today. It's good to be here with other leaders from Holy Trinity, and we hope that we can learn together, Holy Trinity and Westminster alike during this time. I'm sure I will learn things that are spoken in this space as well. I'm going to start with just a little bit of history about Holy Trinity. So Holy Trinity is 117 years old and has been firmly rooted in the Longfellow neighborhood of Minneapolis during that course of time. I would say that if you asked Holy Trinity members what unites the congregation, each member would have a different answer for you, and that's something that we want to celebrate, that there's diversity of opinion within the congregation. That said, I think a lot of people would point to our tagline, and our tagline is traditional worship, contemporary message, a call to social justice. Now, what those things mean, there's probably diversity among how people would define those three aspects of our tagline. But traditional worship, I think, actually much like Westminster, we use a liturgical format of worship, and that means that each time we gather, typically we move through those liturgical forms of gathering, word, meal, and sending. And we really think that worship is this catalyzing force. It's a uniting force for the community that gathers, and then it's a catalyzing force to move us out into our everyday lives where we actually believe that God is calling us into mission and ministry. Contemporary message, I often say, I think it's Karl Barth who says that we should hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And I think Holy Trinity really believes that those two pieces of our life ought to be in conversation with one another. So how does the Bible help us to understand the world, and how does the world help us to understand Scripture? And that's really been an important part of our community's life. And then a call to social justice. We're going to talk a lot more about that today, and so I won't go into that. A few defining moments of our congregation's life that I can see as I look back as a relatively new pastor. I've only been at Holy Trinity for 8 years. of the 117. So I wish there were members who had, well, Anna, you're going to speak to the historical aspect of our congregation's life together. But one of the really pivotal moments for the congregation was that in the 1960s and 1970s, the congregation identified a want to build an apartment complex on our community's near to the church's property. And it was going to be originally it was going to be a senior living facility. And over the course of time, that vision morphed into an affordable senior living facility. And so the congregation really worked hard to mobilize to create a 120 unit property-based Section 8 housing facility for Longfellow. And that commitment to affordable housing, I think, really shaped the congregation's trajectory over the course of the last 40 years. It helped us as a community to have walls, congregational walls that are a little bit more permeable, and directed our attention toward the neighbor in new and important ways. And that building project was followed by another building project where another 24 unit mixed use facility that also includes affordable housing was created as well. So that's a defining moment of the congregation. I'm going to pass the baton over to Anna, who's going to talk about what it feels like or what it has felt like to be someone who's been raised within the community and what formation has felt like in this congregation.
Thanks, Ingrid. So my name's Anna. I'm 23 years old, finishing my senior year at McAllister. And I grew up going to Holy Trinity. My parents are longtime members. And I was a fidgety, giggly, kind of inappropriate kid in church, but super into religious education. I loved confirmation because I got to talk about deep things, and that was kind of my thing. And through that education and also just witnessing the behavior of congregation members, I developed a really strong faith in the compassion and transformative capacity of people to work for the greater good when their basic needs are met. But I wouldn't say a strong faith necessarily in God throughout confirmation. I believe more in the good of people. And I also wondered about the church and its articulation of the why basic needs aren't met and why people aren't able to extend compassion to others. So I saw that more coming from a political, that explanation coming from a political sort of system. So yeah, I love the community, but I didn't see myself necessarily as a church person or driven by that mission until last spring, in one of those defining moments that Ingrid talked about, when the church really opened their doors and stepped into solidarity with the movement for Black lives and against police brutality. And that's when I heard the why begin to be articulated. And that's when I really committed to being involved in this community more. So yeah, I started just when the church opened its doors to protesters. I started organizing medical supplies and just showing up and helping where is needed. And then was eventually transferred to the communication side of what the distribution site that we were last summer. And I guess we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But yeah, just to say, I didn't expect to be as much a part of this community as I am, but I'm super glad to be here. And I've been so awed by the organizing that's happened and the way that all of that organizing rests on relationships first and foremost, which allows for a deeper discernment and a reciprocity that is kind of unmatched. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Debbie, do you want to take it?
Thanks so much, Anna. Thank you all for this space in which we are able to have some conversation. I think a theme that I hear both with Pastor Ingrid's sharing of the historical components and of our tagline, and then of what Anna has shared as a person who grew up and began to find her place in this community, is showing up, and showing up not only as an individual, but into a long line of work that precedes us. And I think that that's a thing that I hear both Anna and Pastor Ingrid sharing, and into which I will delve just a little bit more in what I will share. And that is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, giants who've come before us, and on giants who continue to be pillars of the congregation. That what we do isn't done in a vacuum, and we show up as individuals with questions, and perhaps as individuals who haven't necessarily bought into whatever it is that we hear it being said, but as individuals who recognize that there's been good work, good hard work done before us, that has led into what is happening at the moment. So both the historical components of what has made Holy Trinity what it is, and also what is being experienced as individuals at the moment, kind of just meld together. And that was very apparent for me coming on to staff last year in May. Those pieces just melded together, continue to meld together. We continue to show up, oftentimes figuring out what we're supposed to be doing on the fly, oftentimes figuring out who we are supposed to be at the moment as things are happening, but always recognizing that we show up as a continuation of good hard work that's been done already, and as individuals who may have a lot of questions, may not know the reason why we're showing up, but we do show up. And I think that those two are important things to mention. I wonder if Pastor Ingrid wants to speak a little bit more into that.
Sure. No, that's really beautifully said, David. Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about this past year. When George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, the night after that happened, I got a call on my cell phone at home, and the caller asked me to look at the news and see what was unfolding in the Longfellow neighborhood. And the Longfellow neighborhood became an epicenter of demonstrations because we housed the 3rd precinct, the police precinct that acted as the issuing precinct for the officers involved in George Floyd's murder. And so I turned on the news, and our neighborhood was the heart of righteous anger. And the caller asked if the church would consider opening our doors to become the medic station for the neighborhood. The medic station had previously been housed in another building, but because of encroaching fires, it was no longer a safe place to be. And so they needed to find a new location just hours into the uprising. And I will admit that it was a big ask. We had really been closed, and that was because of COVID. We as a congregation really took seriously our responsibility as people of faith to slow the spread of COVID-19. And so we had closed our doors. We had gone totally online for worship and education. And so when the caller asked, would we open again? I thought to myself, this is a 180. This would be a total reversal of everything that we had discussed and discerned as a community. So after a couple of phone calls to other rostered leaders in the congregation and lay leaders in the congregation, we said yes. And I knew we would already have a few congregants who were demonstrating in the area. That was never a question in my mind. So I called the most likely person who I thought would already be demonstrating there, Bob, and he said that he was already on site, and he happens to have a church key. I guess one of the one of the learnings is, all those church keys that are floating around are actually not entirely bad things. He already had a church key. And so he said, I'll go to the church now and wait for word from you. And he did. He went to the church, waited. And then when I called saying that the community was giving the green light, he propped open the doors and medics came in and the community started to be served in that space. And as I reflect back on that, I think one of the things that has been powerful for me as a white woman is to think about the way that white supremacy gets wrapped up in decision-making structures for people like me. And, I was raised to think that like prudence and shrewdness and cost-benefit analysis were really highly valued pieces of discernment and decision-making. And that night, of course, we went from phone call to doors open. I suppose it was about 20 minutes. We had 20 minutes to make that decision as a community. And so we didn't have a lot of time for prudence or shrewdness or cost-benefit analyses. And I think for me, as I look back on that 20-minute period, what it has taught me is that sometimes our shrewdness allows us to kind of distance from the neighbor. Sometimes our prudence allows us to become emotionally unattached with the needs that surround us. Sometimes our cost-benefit analysis aren't actually as faithful as we think they are. And I've been joking that rarely do we see in scripture somebody come to Jesus for healing and Jesus say, that's a really important question that you're asking, or a really important need that you're articulating. Let me go to the church council in 2 weeks and get back to you about your want or your need for healing. And instead, what we see Jesus do is see the neighbor who's standing right in front of him, really see them like in all of their giftedness and their need, and respond to what it is that they're asking for. And I think this last year has been one exercise after another with that, with saying what is right in front of us as a community, and how are we going to respond with these neighbors and for these neighbors. So all of that to say, I'm going to pass it to Deacon David, who can talk a little bit about like those first days in the medic station and what some of our considerations were as we sought to be faithful neighbors in the midst of a lot of chaos in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Pastor Ingrid. I hear words that I want to gravitate towards in what Pastor Ingrid lifted up. I think one of those words is faithful, faithful response. So there's a lot of deep work that had already been done, theological, personal, in the different working groups that we have as a congregation, where people had already thought, how is it that I'm showing up into my neighborhood? How is it that I'm showing up as a person of faith? And so it that helped the congregation have a faithful response to what was unfolding in our neighborhood, especially following George Floyd's murder. And what I also heard Pastor Ingrid say is righteous anger, the righteous anger that spilled into the streets, that caused that prudence and that sort of the waiting that we would have taken to bring it to church council, and the right prudence out the window in 20 minutes, opening up the doors, recognizing what a faithful response is to righteous anger, is what I hear and what I want to gravitate towards in what I share. Because I was 1 week in to working as this community's community organizer and religious education coordinator. And what I was pleasantly surprised and thankful for was how this community faithfully responded to righteous anger by flinging open the doors of the church building. So recognizing that as other buildings were boarding up, which is a very human, very proper response given the circumstances that were transpiring, boarding up, shutting doors, and heading out of the neighborhood, that this community decided that the faithful response to this righteous anger engulfing the neighborhood was to open our doors, our church building doors. I can speak to different pieces that I remember in those first few days and then into those first few months, with a caveat to say that a lot of it is blurry in my own mind. I've tried to write down some things to see if it makes sense. But just as our building continued to fill up with smoke at some points, I think my brain is fogged up in many ways too, of which evening happened, what happened in a particular evening and whatnot. But I want to say that I think this past summer also helped me to come to understand a little bit more of what it means to be a person of color other than white in this society. And I am obviously, my phenotype is not white. I am a person of color other than white. But last summer really brought that into perspective for me. I had spent a semester of my undergraduate years in Selma, Alabama, and we had traveled out to different parts. We had traveled to Montgomery, where we visited the 16th Street Baptist Church, where someone had bombed that church building. And it really, I had learned about it. I had experienced being in that space, but I had never realized how even in church buildings, my Black-bodied siblings are not safe. And that it became clear to society, even to our day, with the horrendous murders that happened at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. But to recognize that our Black-bodied siblings cannot even be safe within the church building, to have that really become a reality for me was a bit life-changing. And I think that that's part where I want to invite my white-skinned siblings into today, is that oftentimes we may want to respond in a very human way of boarding up, closing doors, and heading out to safer areas. Our Black-bodied siblings cannot even do that in their own church buildings, in our church buildings. And so the faithful response that we as Holy Trinity had this past summer of opening up our church building doors, responding to righteous anger in that way, really, really made that lesson clear for me. A sense of solidarity with Black lives, and a recognition that a symptom of white supremacy is thinking that we can close our doors, board up, and head out and be safe. So that as I think about what I'm sharing, I really want to mention that. What unfolded then was we opened our doors, our church building doors, to the medics, and became a medic center for anyone who needed a place of refuge and healing. As Pastor Ingrid has already mentioned, we simply served as a host for that piece. We welcomed people in, and then we allowed the medics to do what they knew to do, and what we could do is just welcome people in. And that continued on for that week of the uprising. I remember then people coming in off of the streets into our church building as our neighborhood was engulfed by flames, as buildings around us were burning, as chaos kind of filled our streets, as the police responded in bellicose ways and in ways that did not de-escalate, but rather helped foment chaos in our streets. We continued to just stand there with our doors open. And we were physically present, and that's really all we did. Sure, we try to help in different ways, but really just being physically present with our doors open, recognizing that we can't board up, we can't close down. In order to say that we truly believe Black Lives Matter, and to truly say that we are going to respond in a faithful way, we're going to stand here with our doors open for our neighbors. That continued on throughout the week. We did end up closing our doors Pentecost Eve. So again, dates and those don't necessarily make sense, but Pentecost Eve, we did end up closing our doors because we had gotten some word that there might be white supremacists walking around the neighborhood, and who may threaten the lives of folks that we would be wanting to help. So we did close our doors that evening, but the next morning, so I did spend that night in the church building with some of the other pastors. That next morning was when we opened our doors, and I was still confused as to what was happening. But that next morning, Pentecost morning, we opened our doors, and right outside there were already diapers, boxes of diapers, boxes of food already outside. And what we did then was open our doors, pull out tables, set those tables out on our front lawn, and people just kept responding by giving of needs. This came as a call from someone in the church, and maybe Pastor Ingrid can speak to that, who actually made that call. I was just floored by the amount of folks just driving by, dropping things off. This was at the opening of curfew, as curfew ended and we were able to open, and just the response of people who gave so much of their time, their energy, their money, to provide for our neighbors who now were in a food and good desert, with so many buildings still smoldering for those first few weeks, and how we opened our doors, set tables out, and people responded by giving. All of that is, again, a little fumbled up in my mind, but I think that with all of that, I want to gravitate to saying if the church building is not safe for our Black-bodied siblings, it cannot be a safe place for any one of us. And our faithful response to righteous anger is not to board up, to close down, to walk away, but rather to fling the doors open, to be present, and to respond in the ways that we can. And for us at Holy Trinity, that was first a medic station, a place of refuge for people experiencing chaos that was fomented by representatives of the state, and then to simply serve as an in-between person, taking in donations and giving them right back out. So that faithful response to righteous anger in that way. I'll open it up. I'm not sure how we can necessarily move cohesively to a piece, but I'll invite Pastor Ingrid to share any make sense of my ramblings.
No, thank you, Deacon W. It's really powerful, and it made me think about the way that the building, that we thought about the building itself during that period of time. And for weeks after those first tumultuous days, the building just smelled like rotten milk, because so many gallons of milk had been poured over the heads of demonstrators. And of course, we were totally unprepared. In a different world, maybe we would have thought to like put something down on the floor before we started pouring milk, but we didn't. We just simply used the building as a tool for ministry during those days. And I think the congregation that all of us, the ancestral river that each of us stepped into at Holy Trinity, has never been precious about its space. There's been like this deep commitment to sharing the space generously with other communities. So we've got building partners, long-time building partners that are really important to the worshiping community. We house, meetings for about 120 nonprofits a year. So the building really is used as kind of an informal community center for the Longfellow neighborhood. And I think that practice for us over the course of generations helped us to get to a point in the middle of crisis where I can honestly say, my memory is very fuzzy too, but I can honestly say that I never thought to myself, the congregation is going to react poorly to this decision because somehow it threatens the building. That is not something that I ever feared receiving from the Holy Trinity community itself. So I think just like there's been kind of a healthy relationship developed with the physical space. And in these last few weeks, I've heard Black organizers say over and over again, we're waiting for the day when people are not held below property, that Black-bodied and brown-bodied people are more important than property. And I'm not sure that we can say that there has ever been a day in America's history where that we could say with absolute certainty has been a truth for us. And so are we at a point where we as communities can say, you know what, our properties are only that. Our properties on Dakota land. I just, let's be really clear that these properties are only important insofar as they serve the needs of this community. And if they're not serving the needs of the community, then what are we holding them for? What are we saving them for? What are we waiting for in those spaces? So that's what it made me think of, Deacon David. So I'll just share that. But I want to pick up on something you said about how did the word get out? How did all these thousands of people start flooding to the church's front lawn? And how did these cars like line up for miles around us? And Anna is the hero in the communications team about that. So Anna, take it away.
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Ingrid, for that transition. I can definitely talk more about communication, but first I just wanted to say that I really thought a lot about during that summer exactly what you mentioned about how white supremacy shows up in our deliberation and our weighing of options carefully, which is like a great skill, obviously, you know, but I think that oftentimes, especially among white-bodied people, like we take our time and we scrutinize every decision because it allows us to protect our wealth and the sense of safety that we're used to. And in that time, our neighbors wait, you know? And so I think often it hides our true values even from ourselves. So yeah, I learned a lot due to Ingrid's reflections and also just like being there about that. So yeah, I was in communications, which is funny because I don't consider myself a very good communicator, but I did my best. And we had a lot of people following all of our social media at that time. And it was just like such a rushed pace. Like you mentioned, David, like the decision was to throw open the doors, and knowing that that would mean going before we're totally ready and like changing our system of distribution and communication pretty much every night. And so it makes sense that you were exhausted and can't remember anything. It was also hot and like, yeah, it was hard. It was moment to moment, just like try to preempt, then react. And there were also things that were kind of unforeseen that were difficult. Like once we had our distribution set up, we needed people to help. So we had like teams of really generous volunteers coming from everywhere. And I don't know if we ever used the word mutual aid, but I think that's a word that a lot of people are familiar with now after last summer. And that is based on mutual aid means like meeting each other's needs without the help of institutions or professional, like professional avenues. And it also means, like I said, like generating a shared understanding of why those needs aren't met. And it was hard because we had these people coming for one day and leaving, and we were like so grateful for the help, but also how can we use this to like ask the why, like to build a shared understanding of why we are in this moment, you know, of great need. So yeah, just like the volunteer part was definitely challenging, not just for communications, but for everybody out there on the lawn dealing with that. And then it was so amazing to like get packages from all over the country, people like hand sewing for beautiful masks, packaging them up and sending them to us. A library on the East Coast donated like 30 children's books. Just like things like that. I was like, wow, the world is watching this. You know, it was a really amazing position to be in communications. Yeah, so a lot of what I did was just like update social media, try to keep track of supply needs that were changing all the time, be in contact with other distribution sites, and yeah, just like process donations. So it was just like so amazing to be there and to troubleshoot and to get feedback, and to really grapple with like how whiteness shows up in these moments, you know. Yeah, so continual learning process. And we have been reflecting a lot on what happened last summer as we have been preparing for potential unrest now and thinking about what the church will do. Yeah. Let's see, where should we go next?
Emily, do you have some questions that have been coming up in your brain listening?
Yes, definitely. This has been lovely dialogue, and there's been so much touched on. A recent comment made by Anna in regards to the communications built with other supply sites and that action of mutual aid. Has Holy Trinity post last summer been able to keep up those relationships, and even within recent weeks, in the now murder of Dante Wright, have those just interconnected lines of communication maybe sparked back up, or have they always been there since last summer? Like, how has that transpired for Holy Trinity?
Deacon Debbie, do you want to start by just talking about the rapid response team?
Sure, I
Do you have a different idea of where you want to start?
Yes, I can talk about the rapid response team. And I will say too that I think those relationships that we developed there were already relationships that existed prior to the uprising and relationships that were developed during the uprising and the days following it that helped us be able to participate in that massive project of mutual aid into which we participated all of last summer. So I think that addresses a little bit of the question that you were asking. The rapid response team that we began to create was a part of what we considered at Holy Trinity a faithful response to the ongoing needs that we were imagining, that we were seeing in our neighborhood and imagining could be a need in our neighborhood, especially as we waited for the trials to happen. We at Holy Trinity decided that it would behoove us as a community to think through some possible scenarios and to also take lessons learned during the uprising in the last summer and sort of bring a group of folks together to think about these things, talk about these things, and prepare as best as we could in a faithful way for our neighborhood. As it's an ongoing group, it's a group that continues to be shaped and morph into faithful witness to what is needed. And I would say I was very impressed and thankful for our team last week when we learned of Daunte Wright's murder. And we were able to, because we had been doing months-long preparations as a team, Pastor Ingrid was able to ask of us to assemble, and it wasn't to open up Holy Trinity's doors, but it was to respond faithfully to righteous anger that was happening in Brooklyn Center, and to help our siblings in that community respond in ways. So the mutual aid that Anna talked about, the relationships that were developed out of that and what we learned from that has really translated into a continuation now that we were able to take those lessons, talk about them, imagine what our faithful response would be, and to see that our team that was assembled to think about those things deeply, that we were able to assemble on a moment's notice last week and faithfully respond to the righteous anger happening in Brooklyn Center. We still had quite a bit of food. That's one of the examples. We still had quite a bit of food left over from last summer that we had not yet distributed. And Pastor Ingrid and other team members were able to, within a few hours, assemble getting, I think, 8 carloads, maybe 10 carloads of food from Holy Trinity's building out to be staged out front of our church building, and then from there over to Brooklyn Center to Cross of Glory Lutheran there, who is now participating in mutual aid for their community. But that's just one example of the ways in which last summer's lessons learned, and then the team that's been assembled and our learnings in mutual aid have just translated into this sort of we're able to respond in this way, and we can do it, and this is our faithful response to righteous anger.
Yeah, thank you. The Deacon David is right that the team was really able to mobilize quickly, and that's something that we've really learned over the course of the past year and worked on over the course of the past year is how do we take what we didn't know last May and learn from it so that we can respond with the same sort of urgency that a situation actually asks of us. And a friend of mine, after Daunte Wright was murdered and after we began helping Cross of Glory in Brooklyn Center, a friend of mine sent me a message, another clergy person sent me a message saying, I'm sorry that your community knows how to do this. I'm glad that your community knows how to do this. And so how do we take these painful experiences and weave them into who we are as Christian communities so that we can embody love in a new way, embody compassion in a new way, embody justice in a new way, all of the while admitting that we don't do anything perfectly. Like if there's been one thing about this past year, it's like letting go of the understanding that we're going to do it right, because we're not going to do it right. We're going to do what is asked of us at each step of the way, and try to like listen for the Spirit's guidance at each step of the way. So maybe I'm just thinking about this now. I haven't articulated this in my brain, but it's like a movement away from right and a movement towards the Spirit. And I that is oftentimes something that I can't quite articulate. Obviously, in this moment, I can't articulate it, but a movement towards the Spirit and where the Spirit's leading. The other thing I was going to mention is that when you were talking, Deacon David, it made me think of just the way that this has connected our neighborhood. So we, downtown Longfellow that we're a part of, has always had rich connections between organizations and businesses and residents. And there are these beautiful connections that predated last year. And even in the midst of the uprising, that really was a powerful force. So like the milk that was being poured over the heads of people at Holy Trinity was being housed at the independent bookstore. And we were all being fed by the Indian restaurant, the Bangladeshi restaurant that was located across the alley, and businesses were using the church's bathrooms, and all of these like just beautiful connections that even in the midst of crisis and so much unknowing, we actually believed that we could depend on one another, which is a miracle in and of itself. And those connections have really been a strengthening presence for us in the months that have followed, as we acknowledge that we lost a lot of things within our neighborhood. And some of the things that went up in flames, we refuse to mourn. Some of the things that we lost in those days, we've been waiting, some of us have been waiting generations to lose. And others, we lost other things in our neighborhood that were precious. Gathering spaces, gorgeous immigrant-owned restaurants and businesses. There are things that we mourn that went up in flames. And at the same time, this community, as I gather, refuses to, again, put property above people. The mantra, if you will, has been commitment on the part of downtown Longfellow to say, what we're after is bigger than any one of our organizations, bigger than any one of our businesses, bigger than any one of our missions. And so there's been this coalescing of community in a shared vision of now looking towards the future and saying, how do we incorporate what we heard in those streets? How do we incorporate that righteous anger into what we believe this community is going to be in its next chapter of our shared life? And how are the principles of equity, justice, and this like deep sense of belonging going to shape who we are in this corner of Minneapolis for the next 117 years? Or beyond. We have one person in the community who always says, we've got to think about 7 generations from now. How do we think about 7 generations from now? And who do we want to be? And I think that those are powerful reflections. So I don't know why I'm saying all this other than to say that the community has been probably the community and God. The spirit, the community and the spirit have somehow been the deep wells out of which we continue to like pull the water so that we can like keep going for the next day. Anna, I pass it to you. You're gonna clean up here for me.
Not my specialty, but when you were talking about all of the learning that's happened in this community, I was thinking about how all of those connections that have been made in the unrest and also in the uprising and then also in the rebuilding effort are like a tangible way, not just to like build the future we want to see, but also to remember together. And I think so this year has been so hard for so many of us. Like obviously it has been like so much harder for some groups, but I think like there is a risk of sort of locking up these memories and not being changed by what we experienced this year. So as we, I don't know how that exactly this will look at Holy Trinity, but I know that this will happen, but I'm wondering like how we are going to continue to remember and to be affected by those things, even if we couldn't be in the moment, like learning because of our stress response, the fear response. It's something we've talked a lot about in rapid response team is like what happens when you are when you're under stress. One of the things is that you can't learn because you're taking care of your survival needs first and foremost. But so like how are we going to continue to learn and then respond to that? Yeah, I'm just really looking forward to that process continuing. And I see that we have our time keeper.
I'll just say one last sentence before our time runs out. There's this beautiful Sabbath prayer that says, how are we going to weave what we do into who we are? And I think that's what I hear you saying is, how are we going to weave what we've done into who we are and who we are going to be? So thank you.
Well, thank you all, Ingrid and David and Anna. Thank you for sharing your congregation's great response to the Spirit and serving great needs of our neighbors. Wonderful stories, and we can all learn tremendous amounts from that. Thanks for all that you do and continue to do. Our next forum in this series will feature people from the city of Minneapolis with their perspective and insights about reimagining public safety, one of the big issues on everybody's minds right now. So stay tuned for that for the following week. And thanks again to all of you for your perspectives and lessons and response to the Spirit.